Inside California State Prison, gangs, SHU and maximum security. The system built for control. There are prisons, and then there are systems designed to control what prisons cannot. California built one of those systems. A network of high-security institutions, created not just to confine, but to manage violence, power, and influence inside prison walls. Because inside these facilities, control doesn't only come from correctional officers. It comes from inmates, organized, structured, and in many cases, deeply entrenched. Over decades, California's prison system became known for something beyond overcrowding or tough sentencing laws. It became known for gangs. Not loose affiliations, but coordinated groups with leadership structures, codes of conduct, and documented influence both inside and outside prison. Groups that could order assaults, authorize violence, and maintain authority, even from inside isolation units. At the same time, the state developed some of the most restrictive housing conditions in the United States. Units designed to separate, to isolate, and to remove individuals believed to be too dangerous to remain in the general population. Among them, the Security Housing Unit, the SHU, a place where inmates have spent years, sometimes decades, inside concrete cells with minimal human contact. Supporters argue it was necessary to control prison gangs and prevent violence. Critics argue it caused long-term psychological harm and punished inmates without clear pathways out. Both perspectives are documented. Both are part of the story. Because what happens inside California State Prison isn't simple. It's a system shaped by policy decisions, court rulings, internal investigations, and the lived experiences of thousands of inmates and correctional staff. And to understand it, you have to go inside. Not just the buildings, but the structure, the rules, the power, and the consequences. This is not fiction. Everything you're about to hear is based on documented reports, court records, and investigative journalism. But even with all the records, there are parts of this system that remain difficult to fully see, and even harder to fully understand.
Before we dive into today's powerful story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more gripping tales. Your support helps us keep sharing these stories, and we wouldn't want you to miss any of the action. Now, let's get started.
How California built one of the largest prison systems in the U.S. To understand what California prisons became, you have to understand how they grew. From the 1970s through the early 2000s, California's prison population expanded rapidly, driven by policy changes, longer sentencing laws, and enforcement strategies tied to the broader tough-on-crime era in the United States. By 2006, California's prison population had reached over 170,000 inmates, a number so high that multiple facilities were operating far beyond their intended capacity. Gymnasiums were converted into housing units. Bunk beds were stacked in spaces never designed for long-term living, and correctional staff were tasked with managing increasingly crowded environments. This wasn't speculation. It became the subject of lawsuits, federal court reviews, and eventually, a decision by the United States Supreme Court. In 2011, in Brown v. Plata, the court ruled that overcrowding in California prisons had led to inadequate medical and mental health care. The ruling ordered the state to reduce its prison population, not because overcrowding was uncomfortable, but because it had reached a point where it violated constitutional protections. That decision forced major changes, including realignment policies that shifted some inmates from state prisons to county jails. Over time, the total prison population declined. But even as the numbers changed, the internal structure of control inside California prisons remained. Security levels, gang management strategies, and isolation units like the SHU continued to play a central role. Because overcrowding was only one part of the problem. The other was what was happening between inmates themselves. Maximum security, control, movement, and risk. Inside California's prison system, not all facilities operate the same way. Inmates are assigned to different security levels, based on factors like criminal history, behavior, and assessed risk. At the highest level are Level 4 facilities, maximum security. This is where the system places inmates considered the most difficult to manage, not always because of the original crime alone, but often because of behavior inside prison, documented violence, repeated rule violations, or confirmed gang involvement. Inside Level 4, control becomes highly structured. Cells are typically single occupancy. Movement is scheduled, monitored, and restricted. When inmates leave their cells, they are often handcuffed, sometimes escorted by multiple officers. Even routine activities, like showers or medical visits, are controlled through layered procedures. Doors don't open freely. They open in sequence, one gate at a time. Each movement recorded, each step monitored. Because in this environment, uncontrolled movement can lead to violence. And violence in maximum security prisons is not theoretical. It has been documented in official reports, internal investigations, and court proceedings. Incidents involving assaults between inmates, attacks on correctional staff, and organized violence tied to gang activity. Not constant, but significant enough that control measures are built around the assumption that risk is always present. And in this system, control is not optional. It's foundational. The origins of prison gangs in California, long before modern surveillance systems, before digital records, before advanced classification tools, there was another system taking shape inside California prisons. One built by inmates. Prison gangs in California did not appear overnight. They developed gradually, beginning in the mid-20th century, often in response to violence, racial tensions, and the need for protection inside a system where safety was not guaranteed. Among the earliest documented groups were organizations like the Mexican Mafia, formed in the late 1950s inside the California prison system, followed by groups like the Aryan Brotherhood, and later the Black Guerrilla family, each with its own structure, its own rules, and its own identity. Initially, some of these groups functioned as protection networks, but over time, they evolved, becoming more organized, more strategic, and in some cases, more influential. Investigations by federal and state authorities have documented how certain prison gangs developed hierarchical leadership systems, with designated leaders, soldiers, and associates. And while not every inmate is involved in gang activity, these groups have had a measurable impact on prison dynamics, including documented cases where gang leadership inside prison influenced criminal activity outside prison walls, through coded communication, visitors, and other channels that have been identified in law enforcement investigations. This isn't speculation. It has been presented in court cases, outlined in indictments, and studied by correctional agencies for decades. Because in California prisons, understanding gangs isn't optional. It's essential to understanding how the system operates, racial dynamics, and unwritten rules. Officially, California prisons do not assign inmates to groups based on race. That is the stated policy. But inside the yard, a different structure often emerges. One that has been described in investigative reporting, court cases, and first-hand accounts from former inmates and correctional staff. An informal system, sometimes referred to as racial politics. In many facilities, inmates group themselves along racial lines. White inmates, black inmates, Hispanic inmates, and others, not because it's written in official rules, but because it has become part of the social structure inside prison. Where you sit, who you eat with, who you associate with. These decisions are not always casual. They can carry consequences. Multiple reports have documented that crossing these informal boundaries, in certain contexts, can lead to conflict, sometimes violence. The issue has even reached the United States Supreme Court. In Johnson v. California, 2005, the court examined the state's use of race in temporary housing assignments, acknowledging the complex and sensitive role that race has played in prison management. The California Department of Corrections has stated that it does not support racial segregation, and policies have evolved over time. But despite official policy, the reality inside many prisons remains influenced by these dynamics, because systems built over decades do not disappear overnight. And inside prison, informal rules can be just as powerful as official ones. Introducing the SHU, isolation as a tool. And then, there is the SHU, the Security Housing Unit, a part of the prison system designed for one purpose: separation, isolation, control. In facilities like Pelican Bay State Prison, the SHU was specifically built to house inmates considered the most dangerous, or the most influential, especially those identified as gang leaders or key members. Inside the SHU, conditions are significantly more restrictive than general population. Inmates are typically held alone, in single cells, for up to 22 to 24 hours a day. Meals are delivered through a slot in the door. Human contact is minimal. Recreation, when permitted, takes place in small enclosed areas, often with high walls and limited visibility. sometimes described in reports as resembling concrete exercise pens. For some inmates, these conditions last for months, for others, years, and in documented cases, decades. The SHU has been the subject of extensive debate. Supporters argue it was necessary to disrupt gang activity and prevent organized violence. Critics, including legal organizations and human rights groups, have raised concerns about the psychological effects of long-term isolation. These concerns have been examined in lawsuits, academic studies, and state reviews, leading to policy changes in the 2010s, including reforms to how inmates are assigned to long-term isolation. But the SHU remains one of the most defining and controversial features of California's prison system. And to understand it, you have to look at how inmates end up there. Because getting into the SHU is not always about what you did on the outside. Sometimes, it's about what the system believes you are on the inside. Gang validation, how the system identifies threats. Inside California's prison system, identifying gang members is not left to guesswork. It follows a formal process, known as gang validation. For decades, this process has been one of the primary ways inmates were assigned to high-security units like the SHU. But how does it work? According to official CDCR procedures, gang validation did not always require a violent act. Instead, it relied on evidence, often collected over time. This could include possession of gang-related symbols or drawings, written communication, letters or notes linked to known gang members, association with validated gang members, or information provided by confidential informants. Each piece of evidence, sometimes referred to as a source item, was documented and reviewed. And in many cases, multiple source items were required before an inmate could be officially validated as a gang member or associate. Once validated, the consequences could be significant. Inmates could be placed in the SHU, not necessarily for what they had done, but for what the system determined they were connected to. Supporters of the validation process argued that it was necessary, that gangs operated covertly, and that waiting for violence to occur before taking action would be too late. But critics raised concerns. Legal challenges argued that the system relied too heavily on indirect evidence, that inmates could be validated based on association, rather than confirmed actions, and that once validated, it was extremely difficult to reverse that classification. These concerns led to years of litigation, reviews, and eventually, policy reforms. But for decades, gang validation was one of the most powerful tools used to control inmate populations. Because in a system where influence can be hidden, identification becomes everything. Confidential informants and the debriefing system. 4 inmates placed in the SHU based on gang validation. There was, for many years, one primary way out: debriefing. The debriefing process required inmates to provide information to prison officials about gang activity. This could include identifying other members, explaining internal structures, or providing details about past or planned actions. In exchange, the inmate could be reclassified, removed from the SHU, and eventually transferred to a different housing unit. On paper, it was a pathway out of isolation, but in practice, it was far more complicated, because within prison culture, providing information to authorities carries consequences, often referred to as informing or snitching. And in many documented cases, inmates who were labeled as informants faced serious risks from other inmates. This created a dilemma: remain in isolation, or provide information and face potential danger in the general population. Legal advocates and human rights organizations argued that this system placed inmates in an impossible position, that it effectively pressured inmates to provide information, sometimes about events they may not have direct knowledge of. State officials, on the other hand, maintained that debriefing was a necessary tool, a way to disrupt organized gang activity, and gather intelligence that could prevent violence. Over time, the reliance on debriefing became one of the most criticized aspects of the SHU system, and it would eventually play a role in major legal challenges that forced the state to reconsider how inmates were held in long-term isolation. Because when the only way out requires cooperation, the question becomes, is it a choice or a condition? Life inside the SHU, daily reality. Inside the SHU, life follows a routine. But it is not a routine defined by movement. It is defined by restriction. A typical day begins and ends in the same place: a concrete cell, often measuring around 8 by 10 feet, furnished with a bed, a toilet, a sink, and little else. For most of the day, the inmate remains alone. Meals are delivered through a slot in the door. There is no communal dining, no shared space, no direct physical interaction with other inmates. Communication, if it happens, may occur through walls, voices passing through vents, or brief exchanges during controlled movements. Recreation time, when permitted, is typically conducted in isolation, in a small enclosed area, surrounded by high walls, with limited or no view of the outside environment. These conditions have been documented in official reports, court cases, and independent investigations. And while exact experiences can vary, the core structure remains consistent: limited movement, minimal interaction, extended periods of isolation. For some inmates, this environment lasts for months, for others, years, and in certain documented cases prior to reforms, more than a decade. The question of how this environment affects individuals has been studied extensively. But even before looking at the research, the structure itself raises a fundamental question. What happens to a person when their world is reduced to a single room? Documented psychological effects of long-term isolation. The effects of long-term isolation have been the subject of decades of research in legal cases, medical studies, and psychological evaluations. In the 1995 case Madrid v. Gomez, a federal court examined conditions inside Pelican Bay's SHU. The findings acknowledged that while the SHU did not violate the Constitution for all inmates, it posed significant risks, particularly for those with pre-existing mental health conditions. Subsequent studies and reports have documented a range of psychological effects associated with prolonged isolation. These may include anxiety, depression, difficulty concentrating, sleep disturbances, and in some cases, more severe mental health challenges. It's important to be precise here. Not every inmate experiences these effects in the same way, and not every case leads to severe outcomes, but the risk has been consistently recognized. These concerns led to increased scrutiny from courts, from medical professionals, and from advocacy groups. Over time, they contributed to policy changes aimed at limiting the use of long-term solitary confinement, including restrictions on how long inmates could be held in isolation, and expanded reviews of SHU placements. Because while isolation may serve a purpose in maintaining control, its impact on the human mind cannot be ignored. Legal challenges and the end of indefinite SHU terms. By the early 2010s, the SHU system in California was facing growing legal pressure. At the center of that pressure was a question: could inmates be held in indefinite isolation, based primarily on gang validation, without clear evidence of ongoing misconduct? This question became the focus of a major federal lawsuit, Ashker versus Governor of California, filed on behalf of inmates held in long-term solitary confinement. The case challenged the state's use of indefinite SHU placement, arguing that it violated constitutional protections. In 2015, a settlement was reached, and it marked a significant shift. Under the agreement, indefinite SHU terms based solely on gang validation were largely eliminated. Thousands of inmates became eligible for transfer out of the SHU, and a new system, the step-down program, was expanded, designed to allow inmates to transition out of isolation without requiring debriefing. This was a major change, one that altered how California managed gang-affiliated inmates, but it did not eliminate high-security housing entirely. Instead, it reshaped the criteria, shifting focus toward behavior rather than affiliation alone. The impact of these reforms is still being studied, but one thing is clear: the SHU system that existed for decades did not remain unchanged, because even within prison systems, policy can evolve, especially when challenged. Gangs after reforms, did anything really change? After the 2015 reforms, thousands of inmates were released from long-term SHU confinement. Some transferred to general population, others moved into step-down programs. On paper, this marked a major shift in how California prisons handled gang affiliation. But inside the system, change is rarely immediate, because while policies can be rewritten, structures built over decades don't simply disappear. Correctional officials have acknowledged that prison gangs continue to exist and continue to influence inmate behavior. However, the way that influence is monitored has evolved. Rather than relying primarily on gang validation, the system now places greater emphasis on behavior. documented actions, rule violations, and ongoing conduct inside the facility. This shift was designed to reduce reliance on indirect evidence and focus on observable risk. But it also introduced new challenges, because gang activity is not always visible. It can operate through subtle communication, indirect influence, and long-standing networks, which means, even without long-term SHU placement, managing gang dynamics remains one of the most complex tasks within California prisons. How communication happens inside prison walls. One of the most critical aspects of gang activity inside prison is communication, because influence depends on information, and inside a controlled environment, communication is monitored, but not eliminated. Official channels include mail, phone calls, and approved visits, all of which are subject to screening and oversight. But investigations have documented that communication can also occur in less direct ways, through coded language in letters, through intermediaries, or through conversations during limited interaction periods. Law enforcement agencies have identified instances where messages were passed between inmates or relayed to individuals outside prison, sometimes influencing activity beyond the facility. These findings have been presented in federal indictments and correctional intelligence reports. At the same time, prison systems continue to adapt, expanding monitoring systems, restricting certain types of communication, and increasing oversight of known high-risk individuals. Because inside prison, information is not just communication, it's power, and controlling that flow is part of maintaining order. Violence, reality without exaggeration. When discussing prison environments, violence is often the focus, but understanding it requires precision, not exaggeration, not assumption. Documented reports from the Bureau of Justice Statistics and California oversight agencies confirm that violence does occur inside prisons, including inmate-on-inmate assaults, incidents involving correctional staff, and conflicts linked to gang activity. However, it is not constant, and it does not define every moment of prison life. Many inmates serve their sentences without direct involvement in violent incidents, but the risk remains part of the environment, which is why security procedures are structured the way they are. Controlled movement, layered supervision, segregated housing when necessary. Because in high-security settings, even isolated incidents can have wider consequences. Understanding this balance is important, because focusing only on violence misses the broader reality. A system that operates daily, under pressure, managing thousands of individuals with different risks, different histories, and different paths. The role of correctional officers. Behind every controlled movement, every locked door, every monitored interaction, are correctional officers. Their role is often described in simple terms: maintain order, ensure safety, enforce rules. But in practice, the job is far more complex. Officers operate in an environment where risk is always present, where decisions must be made quickly, and where small changes in behavior can signal larger issues. They are responsible for monitoring inmate activity, responding to incidents, and maintaining security across multiple levels of the facility. At the same time, they must navigate the human side of the system, interacting with inmates daily, managing conflict, and operating within policies that continue to evolve. Reports have documented the challenges officers face, including staffing shortages in certain periods, high-stress working conditions, and the need for ongoing training. Because maintaining control inside a maximum security prison is not a static task. It requires constant attention, adaptation, and awareness. A system still evolving. California's prison system today is not the same as it was decades ago. Policies have changed, population levels have shifted, and the use of long-term isolation has been significantly reduced. But the system itself remains complex, still managing security, rehabilitation, and the ongoing challenge of controlling organized inmate groups. Reforms continue to be introduced, reviewed, and debated, because there is no single solution, only adjustments, based on what has worked and what has not. And while some changes have reduced certain practices, they have also introduced new questions about safety, about effectiveness, and about the balance between control and human impact. These are not questions with simple answers, but they are part of the ongoing reality of the system. Because prisons are not static institutions, they evolve, and so do the challenges within them. Inside the walls. Inside California State Prison. There is no single story. There is no single experience. There is only a system, built over time, shaped by policy, influenced by those who live and work inside it. A system where control is constant, where structure defines daily life, and where decisions, both inside and outside the walls, carry lasting consequences. Gangs, maximum security, isolation units like the SHU. They are all part of that system. But they do not exist in isolation. They are connected to history, to policy, and to the people within it. Understanding this system doesn't mean simplifying it. It means recognizing its complexity, because behind every locked door, there is more than confinement. There is structure, there is adaptation, and there are ongoing questions about what the system is and what it should become. If you want more real, fact-based documentaries on prisons and crime, subscribe to The Unspoken Stories and watch the next video, where we go even deeper inside the world most people never see.